Well, my friends, it's been a year. A lot has happened. It feels like several years in one year. I recently made a video about how we've kind of turned up a notch on the dial of technological acceleration. Related to that, I would say you can also feel a distinct shift in the sociopolitical consciousness. It feels like we're departing from something that we've known for a long time and moving into something new and scary, but also generative and exciting. In a word, it feels like we're departing from what has been the predominant liberal paradigm in which we've existed and moving into something new. Something that some people sometimes call the post-liberal. I don't just mean this in reference to Project 2025 or the project of technocratic totalitarianism associated with that. I don't even mean liberal in the specifically American political progressive sense. Rather, I mean a broader shift in which the very categories of right and left are no longer as coherent as they once were. There's a sort of horseshoe effect happening where people on both quote-unquote sides are converging or finding new common ground or new enmities that are previously not coherent in those categories. In conjunction with this political shift, there's also a social shift in which many people, especially young people, are moving toward a new fascination with tradition, especially traditional religion and the ethical and identical structures that come with it. This is something we've seen in a lot of young people and a lot of celebrities. And I wouldn't describe myself as a celebrity, and also probably shouldn't any longer describe myself as young. And yet I too have been drawn into this movement. I've experienced this intense focusing on religion over the course of this year. And while I am drawn by a very personal call, I do also recognize that I'm caught up in a larger zeitgeist because it's happening in conjunction with these changes in our technological and social selves. We're reappraising what the nature of value itself is as we experience a change in what the value of our humanity is. As noted, this movement is sometimes referred to as post-liberalism. Liberalism here doesn't mean liberal in the sense of American progressivism necessarily, although it's related to that. Liberalism in its deeper and more original and inclusive sense refers to the emergence around the time of the Enlightenment in Europe of the so-called Enlightenment subject, or the liberal individual, the person who has individual rights and agency outside of how their role is defined in the community. As rationalistic and scientific descriptions of reality became more prominent, it began to corrode the religious and mythic viewpoints that held communities together in their implicit hierarchies, this sense of I have a role in the larger whole, the larger community, the larger cosmos, some sort of relation to God and to my neighbor that is structured by the very nature of reality. But as we move into this more scientific and technical paradigm that began with the Enlightenment, you start to have this sense of I just am who I am, and I get to choose to determine myself as I want to be. This is why we consider the modern and postmodern periods as characterized by the breakdown of shared narratives of truth by which we would live collectively. For that reason, another name that gets thrown around in reference to this current era is the Metamodern. So after the postmodern, instead of the post-postmodern, we have the Metamodern, even though we are posting about it and often on Meta. And this is fitting because it's an era in which we are reclaiming these traditional objective truths, but also performing them in the mode that we became used to in the individualistic era of postmodernity. And this is crucial to do at a time of flux where we realize that there's too much information being thrown at us and too many informational pockets into which we're being forced and divided. And we have to somehow find a way to unify, but also realize that we have a role in doing that unification. Because one of the things that's at stake here is what we can do together if we actually do have a shared narrative, something that we've lacked for a long time. Because liberalism, even though it's very liberating, has also arguably been the cause of a lot of environmental and social destruction. If everyone's priority is the actualization of their own self, their own desires, their own self-determination and well-being, or their immediate families, that sometimes happens at the expense of the larger community or the larger ecosystem, because it's difficult to motivate a sense of moral responsibility to do something that you otherwise would not do unless you belong to a larger order that compels you to do that or invites you to do that. Arguably, liberalism itself is one of the main forces behind the extractive, technocratic paradigm that we're currently occupying. For this reason, even some former leftist activists in the environmental space, like Paul Kingsnorth, for example, are moving toward forms of traditionalism, even specifically Christianity, and a conservatism of a kind as a sort of last bastion against the individualistic technologization of all of everything always. At the same time, though, we just can't throw away all of the liberalism, because while there are ills that it has wrought, there's also ills wrought very often, as we know, on the other side. Tradition is the vehicle of beauty, of meaning, of togetherness and community, because we need a shared language to be mutually coherent at all. But it can also, as we know, be very oppressive, because in returning to traditions and collective identities, what do we dredge up that oppresses the individual? That's one of the things we've had a problem with in the first place. This is why the impulse on my part is to ground community in something that does transcend us, but is also an immediate personal encounter. That's to say, an encounter with God, God's self as revealed in matter itself in the incarnation. But of course, that too can be problematic, because many people identify as Christian with whom I share virtually no social, political, or ethical commitments, which calls into question if both I and Nick Fuentes identify as Christian or even as Catholic. Is there any meaning in that shared commitment to God under that name? Because of these contradictions, many questions remain for us as a society and for me personally about what good this actually does us. How will this change my behavior? How has it so far? And will it actually change the behavior of the world as people unify on these traditions, or is it a mere ideology and a performance? As Jesus himself says, "You shall know them by their fruits." How can we find an actual synthesis, a synthesis of the community-binding function of religious or quasi-religious identity as a basis for shared value and shared action, and at the same time the liberal freedom that honors the free agency of the individual subject? A synthesis between the individualist liberal who frees themselves to enjoy the good and the collectivist conservative who actually conserves the good that's there to share in the first place. 2026 must be the year of this synthesis, the year of the both and, to be both what you are and what you are not yet, to generate new categories that hold all of this together, literal new words that aren't just left or right, but move beyond them to something more true that actually reflects the challenges we're facing and the way that we are called to face them. The ongoing degradation of the ecosphere in which there are fewer and fewer actual organisms, and the inundation of the infosphere in which it's more and more difficult for the organisms that we are to actually think. Finding this synthesis, that is my Project 2026. What is your Project 2026? What are the value systems you are seeking to reclaim, and what are you going to actually do about them? And whatever you do, and whoever you think you are or are becoming, I hope you have a very generatively synthetic new year.